In 1983, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before, without a single missile being launched. A false alarm, a secret NATO operation, and one Soviet officer's split-second decision nearly triggered World War III. How did we survive the closest brush with nuclear war you've never heard of? Stay tuned to uncover this terrifying Cold War crisis. Welcome to History Love, where we uncover the most shocking, hidden, and untold stories of the past. Today we're diving into an event that nearly ended civilization as we know it. In 1983, a false alarm, a high-stakes military exercise, and a single Soviet officer's gut instinct brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Most people have never heard of this terrifying Cold War crisis, but it was one of the closest calls in history. This is the untold story of how a misunderstanding could have sparked World War III, and how humanity was saved by a decision made in mere minutes. This is not a bluff. With those chilling words in September 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin reignited the world's deepest fear, the use of nuclear weapons. Decades after the Cold War's end, the specter of global annihilation loomed once more. Weeks later, President Joe Biden warned, "We have not faced the prospect of nuclear Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." But what if history held a darker, nearly forgotten secret? A moment in time when the world stood on the edge of destruction, closer than even in 1962. A moment where a single miscalculation, a misunderstood signal, or one fateful decision could have wiped out civilization. This was not just a Cold War standoff lost in the shadows of history. This was 1983, a year when the world unknowingly teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Yet, unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, no dramatic speeches alerted the public, no televised confrontations played out for the world to see. Instead, the fate of humanity was decided in silence, behind closed doors, in a crisis few even knew existed. For decades, the terrifying reality of 1983 remained locked away, buried under layers of classified documents and Cold War secrecy. It wasn't until around 2015, when long-hidden government papers were finally declassified, that the world began to grasp the full extent of what had transpired. But unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which played out in a tense, televised 13-day standoff, the near-apocalyptic events of 1983 unfolded in the shadows over an extended period, unnoticed by the very people who should have been most alarmed. Incredibly, the White House had no idea it was in the middle of a nuclear crisis, not until long after the danger had passed. The U.S. intelligence community, IC, failed to recognize the severity of the situation, allowing multiple close calls to slip by unnoticed. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet officials were piecing together a far more ominous picture. They saw a pattern of events, interwoven moments of tension, miscalculation, and paranoia, that suggested something sinister was afoot. To understand how the world nearly ended in 1983, we must first step into the minds of the Soviet leadership in the late 1970s. The aging rulers of the Kremlin viewed the global balance of power as slipping away. Economically, technologically, and militarily, the Soviet Union was falling behind the West. Worse yet, their deepest fear, the nightmare of a surprise attack, loomed large in their minds. Most of these men had lived through Operation Barbarossa, the shocking Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. They had witnessed firsthand how a nation could be caught off guard, and they were determined never to let it happen again. The paranoia ran so deep that in May 1981, the KGB launched Operation Ryan, the largest Soviet intelligence gathering operation of the Cold War. Its mission? To detect any sign that the West was preparing a nuclear first strike. Ryan stood for nuclear missile attack, a term that encapsulated the Soviets' greatest fear. Another Barbarossa, this time with nuclear fire. With that paranoia fueling their every decision, the stage was set for the terrifying events of 1983. The Soviets were no longer searching for the truth, they were searching for proof of their worst fear. The KGB had already reached its chilling conclusion. The West was preparing to strike first. Now their global network of spies had only one mission: to uncover any shred of evidence, real or imagined, that confirmed their suspicion. At the heart of this paranoia was Yuri Andropov, the ruthless KGB chairman who ascended to power as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in November 1982. Andropov was a man who saw enemies lurking in every shadow, and his greatest fear was a decapitating nuclear first strike from the United States. He believed the West not only had the capability to launch such an attack but also the willingness to do so. Every Western military exercise, every shift in policy, every speech from Washington seemed to reinforce his worst-case scenario. Then came March 1983, the moment Andropov's fears reached a terrifying crescendo. In a single month, President Ronald Reagan delivered two blows that shook the Kremlin to its core. First, he branded the Soviet Union an evil empire, not just an adversary but the very focus of evil in the modern world. Days later, he unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a futuristic plan to render nuclear missiles useless through space-based defenses. Western skeptics dismissed SDI as science fiction, dubbing it Star Wars. But in Moscow there was no laughter. The Soviet leadership believed Reagan's vision could become reality, and if it did, the United States would hold the ultimate power, the ability to launch a nuclear first strike without fear of retaliation. As if that weren't enough, NATO was pressing forward with its own unsettling plans. The US was preparing to deploy Pershing II ballistic missiles in West Germany and nuclear-armed cruise missiles in the United Kingdom. From the Kremlin's perspective, these were not defensive measures but offensive weapons designed for a first strike. Missiles so fast they could obliterate Soviet leadership before Moscow even had time to react. To the West, NATO was a stabilizing force. To Andropov and his inner circle, it was a dagger pointed at the Soviet heart. The fear that had simmered for years was now boiling over, and the Soviet response would soon push the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. To the West, 1983 was just another year of Cold War posturing. To the Soviet leadership, it was the year their worst fears seemed to be coming true. Every move the United States made appeared to fit perfectly into the ominous pattern Operation Ryan had been designed to detect. Paranoia was no longer just a state of mind, it was becoming Soviet policy. Just as Reagan delivered his evil empire and Star Wars speeches, the U.S. Navy launched Fleet X-83, one of the largest naval exercises ever conducted in the North Pacific. It was meant to showcase American dominance, but to the Kremlin, it looked like a prelude to war. The moment of crisis came on April 2, when U.S. Navy fighter jets brazenly overflew Soviet military installations in the Kuril Islands. In Moscow's eyes, these provocative incursions weren't just a show of force, they were the first steps in a coordinated first strike. The Soviet response was immediate: formal diplomatic protests, raised air defense alerts, and swift purges of officers who had failed to respond quickly enough. The message was clear: next time there could be no hesitation. By the summer of 1983, Soviet air defenses were locked in a state of maximum readiness, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. U.S. intelligence in Japan recognized the danger. American analysts warned that the Soviet military was now so on edge that any aircraft straying too close, whether military or civilian, could become a target. It was only a matter of time before tragedy struck. Then, on September 1, 1983, the nightmare became reality. Korean Airlines Flight 007, en route from New York to Seoul via Anchorage, strayed off course over the North Pacific. Due to a navigational error, the massive Boeing 747 unknowingly veered into Soviet airspace, passing over the highly sensitive nuclear submarine base at Petropavlovsk. Soviet radars lit up. To the jittery air defense forces, already primed for an attack, the unidentified aircraft looked like an American spy plane, or worse, the beginning of something far more sinister. As KL-007 crossed the Sea of Okhotsk, Soviet fighter jets scrambled to intercept. Confusion reigned. Attempts to identify the plane failed. Finally, as the airliner was about to leave Soviet airspace, a Su-15 fighter was given the order. A missile streaked through the night sky. Moments later, 269 innocent people, including 62 Americans, were dead. The world reeled in shock, but in Moscow the tragedy only reinforced the KGB's fears. To them, this wasn't a navigational mistake. It was a carefully orchestrated American provocation. An intelligence operation designed to test Soviet defenses or even manufacture a justification for war. Even today, some Russian officials still cling to that belief. The sky had turned deadly. And for the Soviets, the final, most terrifying confirmation of their worst fears was yet to come. The night sky over the North Pacific had already witnessed one tragedy. Now, just days later, another disaster loomed, one that could have ignited a full-scale war. As U.S. Air Force intelligence pieced together the events of September 1st, they realized the Soviet military had been caught in a web of confusion. KL-007 had unknowingly flown through the orbital path of an RC-135 Cobra Ball reconnaissance aircraft, one that had been monitoring a planned Soviet ICBM test launch. But when the expected missile test never occurred, the RC-135 returned to base, leaving the Korean airliner alone in the sky. To Soviet radars, the sudden appearance of a high-altitude, unidentified aircraft on an unusual flight path seemed inexplicable. Was this a spy plane? A decoy? Or something far worse? In the chaos and paranoia of Operation Ryan, the Soviets chose to assume the worst. A single missile from a Su-15 fighter sealed the fate of 269 innocent passengers. The world's outrage was immediate, but inside the corridors of power in Washington and Moscow, something even more dangerous was happening. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy and Khrushchev maintained urgent back-channel communications, the KAL-007 shoot-down shattered what little dialogue remained between the superpowers. Washington and Moscow fell silent. The Cold War had reached a terrifying new low, one where misunderstanding could be mistaken for malice, and silence could be misread as the calm before the storm. Then, on September 3, 1983, just 2 days after the downing of KAL-007, the crisis escalated to the brink of catastrophe. A U.S. Navy EP-3 intelligence aircraft was conducting routine surveillance near the crash site when Soviet commanders, still reeling from the previous incident, convinced themselves that the American plane had violated their airspace. The order was given. 2 MiG-23 fighters screamed into the sky, their mission clear: shoot the U.S. aircraft down. The world was now on the edge of an abyss. One wrong move, one missile fired, and the Cold War would turn hot in an instant. The most dangerous moment of 1983 had arrived. The world was spiraling toward catastrophe. At that moment, a single command, a single missile launch, could have shattered the fragile peace and plunged humanity into nuclear war. General Charles L. Donnelly, commander of U.S. forces in Japan, was facing an impossible decision. The Soviets had scrambled MiG-23s with orders to destroy an American EP-3 reconnaissance aircraft. The EP-3 pilot, realizing the imminent threat, plunged toward the ocean, skimming the wave tops in a desperate attempt to evade the Soviet fighters. At the same time, Donnelly ordered 4 F-15s to intercept the MiGs. The sky over the Pacific had become a battlefield, one miscalculation away from an irreversible disaster. The F-15s had the MiG-23s in their sights. A single radio command could have unleashed a deadly aerial dogfight, lighting the sky with fire and steel. The Soviet pilots, convinced they were under attack, were just as prepared to pull the trigger. War hung in the balance. Then, in a moment of profound restraint, Donnelly made a decision that may have saved the world. He ordered the F-15s to disengage. When challenged by another officer about refusing to fire, Donnelly's response was chilling in its simplicity. "I don't think I'll start World War III this afternoon." The EP-3 barely escaped into Japanese airspace. The crisis for the moment had been defused. But the damage had been done. In Washington, leaders were no longer willing to believe in miscalculation or confusion. To President Reagan and his administration, the KAL-007 tragedy was not an accident, it was a cold-blooded act of mass murder. On September 5, Reagan addressed the nation in a speech that sent shockwaves across the globe. The Korean airline massacre, a crime against humanity. The words were chosen carefully. The message to Moscow was clear. The United States saw the shoot-down as an atrocity, not an error. In the days and weeks that followed, intelligence analysts quietly reached a different conclusion. They pieced together the evidence and realized what had truly happened. Months of heightened tensions, a Soviet military on the brink of paranoia, an air defense system primed to shoot first and ask questions later. The Kremlin had not ordered a deliberate act of war. They had made a series of fatal miscalculations. But it no longer mattered. The official narratives in both Washington and Moscow had hardened. The world was now trapped in an escalating spiral of hostility. And then, just weeks later, came the moment when the world nearly ended. On the night of September 26, deep within the Soviet Union's National Missile Defense Center, alarms began to wail. Soviet satellites had detected what appeared to be a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile launch from Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. Moments later, another alarm. A second missile. Then a third. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. The unthinkable was unfolding. According to the Soviet system, the United States had launched a nuclear first strike. The standard protocol was clear: immediate retaliation. Within minutes, the Soviet nuclear arsenal, thousands of missiles capable of wiping out the United States, Europe, and much of the world, would be unleashed. But that night, one man stood between humanity and annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet air defense officer, was the watch commander on duty. He was not a typical officer, he was an engineer, a specialist in radar and satellite systems. And as he watched the alarms blare, he hesitated. Something felt wrong. The satellites reported only 5 missiles. A real U.S. first strike, he knew, would involve hundreds if not thousands. The logic didn't add up. Petrov had seconds to make a decision. If he reported the attack as real, the Soviet leadership would have had no choice but to retaliate, triggering an all-out nuclear war. But he didn't. Against all training, against all doctrine, against the immense pressure of the moment, Petrov declared the alarms to be a false positive. He ordered his subordinates to stand down. He waited for confirmation. And he was right. The satellites had malfunctioned, fooled by the reflection of the sun off high-altitude clouds. There was no U.S. missile launch. The world had unknowingly come within minutes of Armageddon. This was no hypothetical doomsday scenario. This was real. Had Petrov followed orders, had he reacted the way the Soviet system was designed to react, billions of people would have died in a nuclear holocaust. The world as we know it would have ceased to exist. And yet, almost no one knew how close we had come. Officially, the incident was buried. The U.S. remained oblivious, still locked in its Cold War rhetoric. The Soviet Union never publicized the near apocalypse. But history remembers. And it raises the question, if the world could sleepwalk to the brink of destruction once, could it happen again? The autumn of 1983 was not just another season in the Cold War, it was a season where the world stood inches from annihilation. Stanislav Petrov had already prevented one nuclear catastrophe, but his defiance came at a price. Unlike American General Charles Donnelly, who would later receive a 4th star for his restraint in the KAL-007 crisis, Petrov was quietly cast aside by his superiors. He had saved the world, but in the eyes of the Soviet system, he had disobeyed orders. His career was over. But the doomsday clock had not yet reset. As the West remained oblivious to the near apocalypse of September 26, NATO unknowingly pushed the Soviet Union even closer to the edge. In November 1983, the alliance launched Able Archer 83, a large-scale war game designed to simulate the outbreak of a nuclear conflict. The exercise, meant to test NATO's nuclear command, control and release procedures, seemed routine to Western military planners. But to the Kremlin, still raw from the paranoia of Operation Ryan, the KAL-007 shootdown, and the Petrov incident, it did not look like a drill. It looked like a prelude to nuclear war. For the Soviet leadership, the exercise ticked every box of their worst nightmare. It involved high-level officials, encrypted communications, and a transition from conventional warfare to simulated nuclear strikes, all signatures of a real first strike. Soviet intelligence had long feared that the West might launch a nuclear war under the guise of an exercise. Now, it seemed to be happening before their eyes. The response was immediate and terrifying. A massive nuclear alert rippled through the Soviet military. Across the Warsaw Pact, Soviet SS-20 nuclear missiles were placed on standby. Air bases went on high alert, with nuclear-capable bombers loaded with warheads, ready to take off at a moment's notice. Soviet submarines armed with ballistic missiles moved into attack positions beneath the Arctic ice. The Soviet leadership retreated to nuclear bunkers. The world had stumbled, blind and unknowing, into the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. For days the world unknowingly stood on the brink. Soviet leaders watched every move, waiting for a single misstep, one that never came. Then, on November 11, 1983, Able Archer ended. NATO forces stood down. The bombers returned to their hangars. The launch codes were locked away once more. And deep in their bunkers, Soviet commanders realized they had been wrong. No attack was coming. The crisis was over. But the paranoia it had revealed, on both sides, had been laid bare. Decades later, analysts would conclude that 1983 had been as dangerous as, if not more than, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in contrast to 1962, where Kennedy and Khrushchev had communicated in secret, here there had been only silence, an abyss of distrust, miscalculation, and fear. The world had survived. But just barely. The world remained unaware, but November 1983 was not just another moment in the Cold War, it was a whispered countdown to the apocalypse. Brigadier General Leonard H. Perutz had no idea he was standing at the edge of history when he observed the Soviet military's sudden, chilling escalation. As the chief of intelligence for U.S. Air Forces in Europe, USAF, he knew something was wrong. The Soviets were not simply watching NATO's Able Archer exercise, they were preparing for war. Their forces weren't just on alert, they were locked, loaded, and poised for the unthinkable. When Perutz briefed USAF Commander General Billy Minter, the natural impulse was to respond in kind. A reciprocal alert would be the standard move, a necessary show of force. But Perutz hesitated. He understood the Soviets in a way few did. He saw not an enemy eager to strike first, but a leadership drowning in its own paranoia. If the U.S. followed standard procedures, If it gave the appearance of a matching escalation, it might tip the scales toward disaster. Perutz made a decision as fateful as Petrov's weeks earlier. He advised against raising the U.S. alert level. He counseled patience, restraint. Minter agreed. And so, on the night of November 9, 1983, as Soviet commanders gripped the keys to their nuclear arsenals, as East German infantry sat in their bunkers with live ammunition, as fighter bombers in Poland were inexplicably armed with nuclear warheads, U.S. forces did nothing unusual. They did not flinch. They did not react. And the world kept turning. It took months, long after Able Archer had faded into memory, for American intelligence to piece together just how close the abyss had come. Some in the intelligence community dismissed the crisis, unwilling to believe that the Soviets had truly expected an imminent nuclear strike. But CIA Director William Casey was shaken. When he finally briefed President Reagan, the response was not one of triumph, but shock. "They really thought we were going to attack," Reagan noted in his June 1984 diary. "I feel terrible." The crisis had revealed something far darker than anyone had imagined. The Cold War was no longer a game of strategy, no longer an exercise in deterrence. It had become something more volatile, more uncontrollable. The two nuclear superpowers were no longer rational adversaries locked in a predictable struggle. They were blindfolded giants, stumbling through a dark room filled with tripwires, each mistaking the other's every movement for a death blow. The Soviet people, kept in the dark about so much, were given a rare glimpse into their leader's fears. As Able Archer reached its peak, Politburo member Grigory Romanov delivered an unprecedented national address, warning that the world was on the brink. Factories, schools, and offices conducted civil defense drills. In Moscow, thousands were hurried into nuclear fallout shelters. Soviet generals canceled the annual deployment of soldiers to assist with the fall harvest. Troops were kept in garrison ready for war. And in East Germany, a shadow of 1941 loomed. The Soviets had been caught off guard once before, when Hitler's armies launched their invasion. It would not happen again. For 2 weeks, Soviet infantry units sat in the field with full combat loads and 2 weeks of rations. Their bombers, fueled and armed with nuclear weapons, waited for the order that, this time, almost came. The echoes of Able Archer 83 did not fade easily. Though the world had unknowingly skirted annihilation, the specter of nuclear war lingered like the fading embers of a nearly extinguished fire. Even after the crisis passed, Soviet nuclear forces remained on varying degrees of alert well into 1984. The paranoia that had driven Operation Ryan did not simply vanish overnight. The Soviet leadership still believed that an American first strike was not just possible but imminent. It was only after the death of Yuri Andropov in February 1984 that Operation Ryan, once the harbinger of the world's potential end, gradually wound down. But for those who had lived through the silent Armageddon of 1983, the lessons were clear. The world had nearly ended, not by deliberate malice, but by the fog of fear, miscalculation, and the terrifying momentum of suspicion. For Brigadier General Leonard Perutz, the crisis defined the rest of his career. He was promoted to Major General and replaced Major General James Faughts as the senior intelligence officer on the air staff. His quiet heroism did not go unnoticed. Within 2 years, Perutz was promoted again to Lieutenant General and took the helm of the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1985. But as the years passed, Perutz could not shake a deep and unsettling realization. His decision to advise restraint during Able Archer had been made on instinct, not on any formal policy or intelligence directive. The U.S. had stumbled into safety just as easily as it could have stumbled into oblivion. Upon his retirement, Perutz took an extraordinary step. He authored a classified end-of-tour report detailing the events of Able Archer 83 from his unique perspective. His report, completed in 1989, was a warning. The intelligence community had failed to recognize the depth of Soviet fears. The crisis had not been a theoretical exercise. It had been real, and the world had barely survived it. Perutz's concerns did not go unheard. The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, FIAB, launched a full-scale investigation into the 1983 war scare. Their final report, completed in 1990, praised Perutz's restraint and confirmed that the U.S. had, indeed, come perilously close to nuclear war. But the truth did not emerge easily. The FIAB report remained classified for 25 years before it was finally declassified in 2015, revealing to the public for the first time just how close the world had come to catastrophe. Even more controversially, Perutz's own report was finally declassified by the State Department in February 2021, only for the CIA to sue to have it reclassified. In an unprecedented legal battle, the truth of Able Archer 83 hung in the balance once more. On October 4, 2022, a federal judge ruled in favor of the CIA. The Perutz report would be reclassified, locked away once again in the vaults of secrecy. The world would forget. But for those who knew, the memory of 1983 was an unheeded warning, one that still waited in the shadows of history for its moment to return. The world would never know how close it had come to destruction in those dark days of 1983. The silent hand of fate, or perhaps something greater, had intervened. Whether through the instincts of a few men who refused to escalate, the hesitations of a watch commander who saw through the fog of false alarms, or simply sheer luck, nuclear fire had been held at bay. For all the mistrust, the paranoia, and the misunderstandings, there had been just enough reason left to stop the unthinkable. The blindfolded boxers had stepped back from the edge, their final blows never thrown. Years later, President Reagan would stand before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and urge Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. The Cold War would eventually end, not in the horror of nuclear winter, but in cautious diplomacy and the slow, painful dismantling of old enmities. But the story of 1983 remains a testament to the fragile nature of peace. It is a reminder that the abyss is never far away, and that the fate of the world can rest in the hands of a single individual at a single moment in time. And so, we can only look back with a sense of solemn gratitude, grateful that war did not come, that missiles did not fly, that humanity was given another chance. Perhaps it was providence. Perhaps it was wisdom. Perhaps it was something beyond our understanding. Whatever it was, we can only whisper a quiet thanks. The world was spared,